Red Mountain was not a peak. It was a name, a penance, and the final boundary of Ransom Kaine's known existence. His derelict outpost, known derisively by the locals as the Outpost, was a rotting block of concrete, braced by rusted steel beams and wind-warped corrugated iron. It was a scar upon a desolate landscape, where the ceaseless cold wind carried the scent of grit, the sulphurous tang of abandoned mines, and the ever-present stench of Ransom's regret. Ransom Kaine lived there like a trapped ghost. He was not a recluse by choice. He was a disgraced former ranger, exiled from the system after a deadly mistake he couldn't unmake. A split-second decision that had cost 3 innocent lives and nearly collapsed a months-long operation. The ranger badge was a painful memory, metaphorically nailed to the wall of his soul. Solitude was his sentence, and he bore it silently. Ransom's days were a grim loop of preparation and futility. He rose before dawn, while the deep shadows still clung to the mountain slopes. His arsenal, though small, was maintained with obsessive detail. The double-barreled shotgun meticulously oiled, the ammunition checked for moisture, and his old combat fatigues patched but always ready. This was not the habit of a hermit. It was the ritual of a discarded soldier who still craved a threat large enough, worthy enough, to justify his persistent existence. His official job, repairing broken radio gear for any lonely prospector or passing merchant, was less a profession and more a desperate attempt to reconnect with the world that had cast him out. He sat in the cold operations room, staring at burnt circuits and static frequencies. Every time he attempted to fix a radio, he was essentially trying to splice the frayed connection between himself and humanity. The constant crackle of static on the speaker was his only companion, a symphony of isolation. Red Mountain was both his refuge and his harsh prison. The jagged terrain, the brutal weather, and the sparse inhabitants, reckless gold panners, societal rejects, or those burying a past, were all reflections of Ransom's own failure. He had tried to run from the system, but the system was ingrained in his blood. His hand-to-hand combat skills, tracking ability, and tactical sharpness remained, waiting for a knot to untangle, an act of atonement. On clear nights, when the lights from the distant town miles away couldn't penetrate the thick mountain mist, Ransom often sat on the porch, his shotgun resting on his lap. He stared into the darkness, not looking for the usual predators, coyotes, bears, but for something larger, a threat great enough to make his death meaningful, or more importantly, to allow him to serve one last time. He craved an opportunity to earn back the honorary badge he had lost, but he feared it would never come, and he would simply rot away in the stillness of Red Mountain. He recalled the day he left. There was no court-martial, no formal sentencing. Just a brief, tense conversation with his former superior, Captain Reyes. Reyes had looked at him with disappointment mixed with pity, a look heavier than any accusation. Reyes had said, "Ransom, you crossed a line. Some wounds don't heal. You can go, but you'll have to find your own way back if you can." Those words haunted him. Find your own way back. It meant no shortcuts, no easy forgiveness. He had to face his fears and failures alone. In the years at Red Mountain, Ransom had learned to listen. Not to the radio, but to the silence. The silence of the mountain was often deceptive, masking the smallest sounds. A snapped twig under an animal's foot, the changing direction of the wind, or a distant rockslide. But recently, there had been a different silence, one that was heavy and deathly, seeming to overwhelm even the wind. He dismissed it as the product of prolonged isolation-induced paranoia. But the old ranger instinct, though sealed beneath layers of regret, whispered a warning. He increased his patrols, venturing further from the outpost, but found nothing, only faint wolf tracks, or the slide marks of a hunting snake. Yet, something was wrong. One evening, checking his animal snares around the perimeter, he found a snowshoe hare, torn apart. Normally he would assume a fox, But when he crouched down, he saw the wounds were too clean, too precise. The blood had been drained almost perfectly, and the carcass was neatly placed on a flat slab of rock, like a gift or a warning. Ransom peeled off his glove and touched the dried blood. It was not the work of a regular predator. Bears were clumsy. Foxes left haphazard bites and scratches. This was focused devastation, a frightening accuracy. He wiped the stone clean with his thumb. The incident intensified the sense of dread that had been plaguing him for weeks. He gripped his shotgun tighter, staring into the thick darkness of the distant pine forest. He wasn't looking for redemption anymore. He felt something was looking for him. He returned to the outpost, his usual exhaustion replaced by a cold surge of adrenaline. He knew this place. He had lived and survived its harshness. But now, Red Mountain seemed to be holding a new secret, one colder and sharper than the night winds. He checked all his radio gear again. All dead, as usual, leaving only a low hum of static. But this time, the interference seemed to carry a different frequency, like the faint rasping of a starving entity. He stood straighter, his body, gaunt from solitude, tensing. The long-lost capacity for service was stirring again, demanding attention. He had been waiting for a threat big enough. Perhaps finally it had arrived. The outpost's false peace was shattered the following afternoon, when a battered all-terrain vehicle roared up the dirt track, spitting out a huge cloud of red dust. The driver was Silas Vance, a greedy, notoriously paranoid prospector. Silas was not a man who would beg for help if he merely lost gold or his self-respect. His appearance was ragged, clothes stained with mud and sweat, eyes wide with terror. Silas scrambled out of the vehicle, staggering toward Ransom, sputtering a story of inexplicable loss. Kaine, I need you. They're gone. All of them. My crew. Silas nearly collapsed. Ransom, maintaining a cold distance, nodded. Lost the gold, Silas? Not the gold. Silas shrieked, his desperation genuine. 3 healthy men. Kaine. 3. My sluice boxes are intact, but Joe, Martinez, and Tusk, gone. In one night, Ransom had been ready to dismiss Silas, who often suffered from paranoia after long periods isolated in the canyons. But the next detail grabbed the old ranger in him. No signs of a struggle, Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Just blood. Plenty of blood, but not enough. You understand? Not enough for 3 men. And the claw marks. Silas described the scene. Dried streaks of blood on the tent floor and rocks, disproportionate to the casualties, and deep scratches on a nearby tree trunk. They weren't bear scratches, Silas trembled. Bears don't scratch that clean. They were deep, sharp, and they were abnormally long. The feeling of wrongness that Ransom had experienced with the hare carcass now surged. The instinct of the old ranger told him this was a threat beyond normal patrol range, far exceeding smugglers or wild beasts. This was a threat that required a solution from the system, but the system had discarded him. Ransom agreed to investigate. He didn't do it for Silas's money, or for the safety of the distant town. He did it because he recognized that this might be his chance for atonement. Following the faint tracks up the cold canyons, Ransom and Silas plunged deeper into the abandoned mining area, a place even the sun struggled to reach. When they arrived at the camp, a dead silence occupied the space. The tent had been brutally ripped open, not through tearing, but through cutting. Ransom found the blood trail Silas had mentioned. He knelt, tracing the ground with his fingertips. The blood was dry, but the evidence of mutilation remained. The horrifying truth. The blood volume was only enough for 1 serious wound, not the death of 3 adult men. This was an act of draining, not dismemberment. He tracked the claw marks. They ran high on a large pine tree, well above Ransom's head, indicating the creature was large and could stand upright. The scratches were deep enough to penetrate the thick bark and reach the fresh wood beneath. They were unlike anything he had encountered from a bear or any known wild animal. Silas, too terrified to proceed, pointed toward an old coal mine entrance, sealed off by rotten wooden planks. "They went in there. I heard the screeching around dawn. They definitely went in there." Ransom told Silas to return to the vehicle and wait. He armed the shotgun, checked his flashlight, and with the measured caution of a soldier entering an ambush, he ripped apart the planks and stepped into the waiting darkness. Inside the old shaft, the air was damp and cold, thick with the smell of decay, rot, and sulfur. Ransom's flashlight beam cut through the rotting wooden columns and jagged rocks. The deeper he went, the greater the tension. He heard nothing, and that was the most terrifying part. The predator had to be down here, silently waiting. After a rough bend, his light fell upon a sight that made even a hardened former ranger shudder. It was a large area, once a miner's resting space, now a brutal graveyard. Ransom found the human remains systematically mutilated, not merely torn apart, but drained of fluids. The bodies, now only desiccated husks of skin clinging to bone, were scattered among shards of broken equipment and rust. Their eyes were wide in silent horror. "The work of an intelligent predator," Ransom muttered. "This killer didn't kill out of instinctual hunger. It killed with calculated cruelty." He continued searching for clues. The footprints on the clay floor were sharp hooves, unlike any local animal. It moved on four legs when running but could stand upright. And it was tall. Amidst the chaotic remnants of torn clothing and steel fragments, Ransom Kaine found a small, cold object, glistening in his flashlight beam. His own old badge. It was his Ranger Commendation shield, the one he had left in a locker at his base when he left. It had gone missing, and he assumed it was lost in transit. His blood ran cold. The fact that the creature had somehow acquired the badge, a personal item carefully stored, and brought it from a distant location to this lair, placing it among the remnants of its victims, was a terrifying affirmation. This monster was not just a beast. It was an intelligent entity. It had been watching him. It knew who he was. And it had some mysterious connection to his buried past, to the deadly mistake that had led to his exile. The sensation of guilt and dread was replaced by cold fury. He tucked the badge into his breast pocket, where it felt heavy as a curse. Ransom mentally named it the Night-Husk. A gaunt form, terrifying amber eyes, as Silas had described, and monstrous speed. The Night-Husk was not merely a predator. It was a personal demon. Ransom knew he was no longer investigating a missing persons case. He was entering a desperate fight against a foe intimately acquainted with his deepest secrets. He couldn't allow it to exist. The Night-Husk survival threatened not only his life but his fragile chance at redemption. He turned out of the lair, leaving the remains of the prospectors behind. Silas Vance was gone, having fled in terror. Ransom didn't care. The enemy was identified. The battle had begun. After discovering the personal link, the Night-Husk launched an immediate counterattack. It pushed the fight from the distant mining area directly to Ransom's outpost. That night, the outpost was plunged into a siege of mounting tension. The creature didn't just attack physically. It waged psychological warfare. Ransom was sitting at his workbench, checking specialized steel-core shotgun slugs, when the sharp scratching sound echoed on the corrugated iron roof. The Night-Husk did not charge directly. It ran on all fours with blinding speed and terrifying amber glowing eyes, circling just outside the outpost's weak light perimeter. It shrieked, a high-pitched, sharp sound, like metal grating against bone. It was trying to deprive Ransom of sleep, pressuring him into a mistake. Ransom, despite having gone through the most grueling training, could not suppress his anxiety. This monster behaved as if it understood tactics. The peak of the threat came just before dawn. Ransom found a body part, a desiccated hand belonging to Joe, the prospector, arranged artistically right on his doorstep, placed atop his old badge. It was a clear message: I know your past, and I am closing in. Fear was replaced by cold fury. Ransom knew he couldn't run or call for rescue. This fight was his alone. The outpost couldn't defend him forever. Concrete would crack, doors would splinter. He had to attack. He spent the entire day converting the outpost from a hideout into a death trap. First, he re-equipped himself with the remnants of his military life. 3 flashbang grenades, non-lethal but capable of crippling all senses for several minutes. Then, he gathered all the remaining mining explosives from his store, a small amount but enough to cause a localized cave-in or massive concussion. Ransom carefully laid steel plates and razor wire around the narrow entrance to the mine shaft he had discovered the previous day. He wasn't going to wait for the Night-Husk to come. He was going to find it. He would use its own speed against it. He loaded his shotgun with the special steel core slugs, each shell a promise of retribution. He carried a large fighting knife, an inseparable companion from his ranger days. You want psychological warfare? Ransom thought, looking at the badge in his hand. You'll get a real war. He switched tactics. The ambush would take place in the thick darkness of the mine, where the Night-Husk's speed advantage could be nullified by Ransom's familiarity with close-quarters tactics. He was ready to launch the most brutal and reckless ambush of his life. The second twilight after the badge discovery, Ransom returned to the mine. He came not to defend, but to assault the Night-Husk's lair. The moon was obscured, and the darkness in the coal mine was so thick it swallowed his flashlight beam. Ransom moved in, relying on instinct and experience fighting in restricted spaces. He heard movement instantly, a slight hiss. The Night-Husk had detected him. The creature lunged, its amber eyes flashing in the gloom. Ransom reacted. He tossed the first stun grenade. The small blast echoed, and the thick military smoke, carrying a strong chemical odor, immediately covered the shaft entrance. The Night-Husk, stunned and disoriented by the smell and the blindness, recoiled, its hiss turning into a howl of pain. Exploiting the Night-Husk's confusion, Ransom moved along the wall, pushing it into a narrow corner, close to where he had planted the explosives. As the Night-Husk repositioned itself, Ransom detonated the small explosive charge he had preset on an old support column. The blast wasn't huge, but it served as a feint and triggered a minor rock fall, severely injuring the creature's flank and deafening it. The Night-Husk, enraged and disoriented, charged out of the darkness, abandoning all caution. It was a gaunt shape of pure fury, claws raised. Ransom plunged into a bloody close-quarters fight. He used his ranger hand-to-hand experience, not to match its strength, but to dodge its lethal claws. He used the fighting knife as a distraction, and finally, with a special shot from his shotgun aimed almost point-blank, he ended the creature right in the narrow mine passage. The next morning, Ransom spent hours meticulously cleaning up the scene. He used the remaining explosives to collapse the mine area, burying all evidence of the Night-Husk and the bodies of the prospectors. He ensured every trace of the threats in human nature was eradicated. Ransom drove to the nearest town, facing Captain Reyes at the patrol headquarters. Reyes had aged, but his eyes were still sharp. Silas Vance reported that he went with you, Reyes said. Then he turned back and said you were still in the mine. What happened, Kaine? Ransom, tired but resolute, fabricated the story. A large smuggling gang was using the old coal mine as a cache. They captured and killed Silas's men. I tried to intervene. There was a large shootout. Everything blew up when I tried to destroy their weapons cache. No one survived. Silas was too scared and ran. Reyes stared at him. Reyes did not believe him completely. The mine collapsed, the large smuggling gang. It all sounded too dramatic for the area. But Reyes noticed the firm look and the change in Ransom. a return of purpose. Reyes nodded slowly. Ransom, this incident is beyond my jurisdiction. I'll send a scene investigation team, but they will find what you want them to find. An unspoken understanding passed between them. Reyes offered him a way back in part-time, under the guise of an independent contractor. There are threats beyond the scope of ordinary investigation, Kaine. And you are the only man capable of dealing with them. Ransom Kaine had redeemed his purpose, and perhaps even his old badge, which he now wore in his pocket as a dark reminder. He had not spoken the truth, and the price was living with a dark secret. He had returned to the system, but he had become a night warden, the man responsible for keeping the secret of what truly lurked in Red Mountain. Ransom Kaine lived on Red Mountain like a ghost trapped within a broken machine. His dilapidated outpost, fashioned from rusting steel beams and decaying lumber, was an open wound upon the desolate landscape. Here, the tireless wind howled through every gap, carrying the scent of industrial dust, the residue of a mining past, and the profound regret of the man inside. Ransom was not a voluntary hermit. He was a disgraced former ranger, exiled from the system after a fatal mistake he could not scrub from his memory. The day he lost his badge and cost a comrade his life, he lost his name and his sense of purpose along with it. His routine maintenance of broken radio gear, tuning into static and occasionally catching meaningless snippets of external chatter, was not a profession, but a tedious ritual. A desperate attempt to reconnect with the world that had cast him out. Solitude was a fair sentence, and he accepted it tacitly, yearning for an opportunity, however small, to earn back the designation he had squandered. Red Mountain was not just a refuge but a self-imposed, rugged prison. He spent much of his time maintaining an arsenal and the specialized combat skills long forgotten from his special ops days. The double-barreled shotgun under his cot was perpetually loaded, and his combat knives were honed to reflect the weak light of the oil lamp. Ransom waited, not for a common threat, but for an event grand enough, terrible enough, to justify his continued existence, to prove he was still worth more than junk abandoned on the mountain. His waiting was the conscious patience of a predator. The fabricated piece of Ransom's life shattered late one afternoon when the clattering engine of an ancient salvage truck dragged itself up the gravel track, announcing the arrival of an uninvited visitor. It was Silas Vance, a frantic, paranoid gold prospector, his beard ragged and his eyes bloodshot from fear and lack of sleep. Silas hadn't come to report a simple gold heist, but a loss far more inexplicable and terrifying. 3 men, Silas stammered, his face pale under the outpost's dim headlamps. 3 strong, capable men, gone. Not a sound, not a shot fired. Ransom, initially skeptical, tried to dismiss him. Prospectors vanished all the time, to greed, to mine accidents, or to each other's guns. However, Silas's account, though riddled with contradictions and exaggeration, contained chilling details that seized Ransom's attention. Silas spoke of the scene. Not a pool of blood, but scant, dried streaks on the stone, inconsistent with the casualties of 3 men. More importantly, he described deep gouges that could not possibly belong to a bear or any predator Ransom knew. They were razor-sharp troughs carved with brutal force, yet possessing an oddly deliberate, almost geometric pattern. The feeling that something was wrong surpassed Ransom's exhaustion and apathy. The instinct of the former ranger, buried deep beneath layers of guilt, surfaced. This was a threat operating outside the scope of regular patrol, one requiring the specific weapons and experience only he still possessed. He agreed to investigate, not for Silas or his worthless gold, but for the pull of old duty and the need to justify his being. Following the trail into the cold canyons, Ransom ventured deep into the abandoned mining claim owned by Silas. The high mountain air grew thick with a lethal silence. He found the camp, where the tent had been ripped apart, not with brute strength, but with terrifying surgical precision. Ransom knelt, touching a dark, dried streak. By experience, He knew the fluid had not merely been lost, but sucked dry with startling speed. He looked up the canyon wall where the sharp rock faces bore the telltale scratch marks. Ransom picked up his shotgun, checking his specialized rounds. This predator was hiding in the shadows of Red Mountain, and it was not something to be managed with standard-issue sidearms. Ransom located the entrance to the old mine, a black, hungry hole abandoned decades ago. Inside, the cold, damp air carried the powerful stench of iron and deep decay. The profound darkness of the shaft had hidden a horror. Ransom proceeded, relying on a powerful flashlight and instinct. The scene within surpassed even the most brutal carnage he had witnessed during his service. He found bodies systematically destroyed, not merely torn apart, but drained entirely of fluid, the flesh desiccated and stretched taut like old leather sacks emptied of their contents. This was clearly the work of an intelligent, vicious predator, one utterly alien to the natural mountain ecosystem. This creature did not kill to consume. It killed to siphon life. Amid the fragments of bone, rust, and shale, Ransom Kaine's flashlight beam caught a small, cold object. It was an item so familiar it squeezed the breath from his chest. His own old ranger badge, the insignia he had discarded upon his dishonorable discharge, perhaps in a junkyard hundreds of miles away, or lost in the very incident that cost him his rank. The fact that the entity had carried that badge from elsewhere, across great distances, only to purposefully place it amidst the remnants of its victims was a chilling declaration. This monster was not just a vicious beast. It was sentient. It had been following him, it knew who he was, and had some terrifying, unspoken link to his buried past. Perhaps the very genesis of the mistake that led to his exile. Ransom backed away, a tremor of cold running down his spine, not from the mind's temperature, but from the sudden understanding. This hunter was playing a game. He named it the Night-Husk. Gaunt in form, its eyes hypothesized to burn red in the dark, and its speed legendary. He realized the investigation was over. The hunt had begun, and he was the quarry. Following the discovery of the badge, the Night-Husk abandoned the game of subtlety. It escalated the conflict from the remote mining area directly to Ransom's isolated outpost, turning his sanctuary into a staging ground. The creature did not just assault him physically. It waged psychological warfare. It moved on four legs with blinding speed, a blurring dark haze, its eyes glowing terrifyingly like twin red stars in the mountain night. It did not immediately attack. It paced just outside the weak perimeter of the outpost lights, emitting dry, raspy growls and scratching frigidly at the wooden walls, sowing fear. Ransom sat still, listening to the guttural sounds and the clicking claws on stone, feeling the vicious intelligence of his adversary. The climax of the psychological threat came near midnight. When Ransom peered through a small firing slit, he saw the Night-Husk retreat into the darkness, but resting on the threshold of his entrance, starkly visible in the weak moonlight, was a clear warning. It was a partial body of one of the victims, arranged sickeningly, an aesthetic statement of death. The creature was letting him know it could reach him any time, anywhere. Fear was replaced by the cold fury of the cornered soldier. Ransom knew he could not hide, nor could he wait for rescue. He had to engage the Night-Husk on its own terms. He re-equipped himself with the remnants of his military life. Stun smoke grenades, enough to blind the Night-Husk in an enclosed space. The shotgun loaded with specialized rounds, heavy slugs and custom salt rock cartridges. And a small supply of mining explosives left over from his part-time demolition work. Ransom transformed the outpost from a hiding spot into a final redoubt, reinforcing doors and calculating angles. Yet, he knew the Night-Husk would wait for him to make a mistake. Ransom decided. Instead of waiting, he would take the fight back to the lair. He would use his tactical experience to exploit the creature's overconfidence to spring the most brutal ambush of his life. At dawn, Ransom returned to the mine not to defend, but to attack. He walked into the darkness carrying the chilling stillness of a man who had accepted his fate. His plan relied on chaos. The moment the Night-Husk detected the intrusion and charged, Ransom threw a military smoke canister onto the floor, releasing a dense chemical cloud. The smoke disoriented the Night-Husk in the enclosed environment, obscuring its glowing eyes and causing it to shriek in confusion and rage. The Night-Husk, forced into a corner of a narrow side tunnel, was momentarily trapped. Ransom detonated a small block of explosives he had planted earlier. The blast was not intended to kill, but to create a faint attack and severely wound the Night-Husk with flying shrapnel. When the Night-Husk, stunned, badly injured, and fueled by insane fury, burst out of the smoke, it was no longer a swift shadow, but a wounded killing machine. Ransom initiated a brutal, close-quarters fight. He used his hand-to-hand training to evade the creature's deadly claws, driving it back with the butt of his weapon, desperately trying to maintain distance. Finally, the Night-Husk roared, poised for a killing strike, and Ransom, with a singular specialized blast from the shotgun, a heavy, handmade alloy slug, punctured its thin skull, dropping the entity dead in the passageway. The following morning, Ransom spent hours meticulously cleaning the scene. He used the remaining explosives to collapse the mine entrance, burying both the Night-Husk's corpse and the horrific evidence of its victims. He ensured every trace of the unnatural nature of the threat was erased. In the nearest town, Ransom Kaine, the disgraced ranger, appeared weary but resolute. He reported to Captain Reyes, spinning a detailed lie about a large smuggling ring that had accidentally destroyed themselves in a mine collapse due to mishandling old explosives. Reyes, a weathered officer who dealt with corruption and death daily, did not entirely believe the story of the perfect accident. But he saw the resolve in Ransom's eyes and the strange shift in his demeanor, a deadly calm replacing the old torment. Reyes nodded, accepting the necessary fiction. He offered Ransom part-time work, an unspoken understanding that Ransom Kaine was the only man capable of handling threats that were outside the scope of normal investigation. He had redeemed his purpose, but the cost was a terrible secret. A secret he now had to guard at all costs, for he knew the Night-Husk was only one of the things lurking in the deep shadows. He had become the warden, no longer the exiled. Ransom Kaine advanced with a caution that prolonged isolation had failed to dull. The ravines led down to the abandoned mining operation known as the Cinder Vaults, a complex network of tunnels and shafts dormant for over a decade. The air here was colder despite the protection of the canyon walls, a chill that was not natural but the product of an absence of life. Ransom found the main entrance, a rusted iron shaft half-blocked. He paused, sniffing the air. The metallic tang of decay and death lingered, but there was no scent of fresh blood or animal musk. The stench was old, desiccated, as though putrefaction had been suspended by some other, more brutal process. He activated the tactical light mounted on his semi-automatic rifle and stepped inside. Darkness immediately swallowed all natural light. 100 meters within, Kaine's beam illuminated a sight that made him, a veteran of several conflicts, narrow his eyes in dread. This was not the lair of a common predator. It was a calculated abattoir. 3 bodies of gold panners, the strong men Silas Vance had mentioned, were strewn across the floor of gravel and quartz chips. But they were not typical corpses. They had been drained. Their muscles looked like desiccated rawhides stretched tight over skeletal frames, their skin a shade of ash gray, and their wide-open eyes like exposed wounds, entirely devoid of fluid. There was very little dried blood on the floor, not enough to account for such violent butchery. The attacker hadn't torn the victims for meat, but to extract something worthless to other predators. Ransom knelt, using the butt of his rifle to turn over a piece of the remains. Around the joints and throat, he noted wounds made by a sharp, powerful tool, yet not resembling teeth or claws. They were deep, crescent-shaped lacerations, as if created by surgical blades or incredibly hard biological talons. Not a bear. Not a wolf, Ransom muttered. Not human. The silence in the vault was heavy and oppressive. Upon closer inspection, Ransom noticed a strange arrangement. The bodies were positioned facing a central point, a partially collapsed excavation zone. This wasn't random. It was a presentation, a territorial marker. Ransom began to feel the cold deep in his bones, a chill that defied his thick coat. He moved deeper into the den, acting against the instinct of a ranger to retreat and call for backup. But he knew well enough that backup wasn't allowed to come here, and the world had discarded him. He was the only one left to handle this. He found a small rock niche, apparently the creature's primary refuge. Here, the foul stench was more intense, but still the dry, metallic odor. Inside, Ransom found torn belongings. Backpacks, comms gear, and a few personal effects of the victims. The creature had clearly searched, not for food, but perhaps for intelligence, for collection. This was the point where brutality curdled into personal horror. Amidst the scraps of fabric and rusted metal, perched on a flat slab of rock like an altar, Ransom saw a small, shining object. It was placed there, not discarded or crushed, but displayed. Ransom reached out, picking it up. The cold metal touched his skin, and he almost dropped it from the shock. It was a senior ranger's badge, the kind he himself had worn. Not just any badge. He recognized the small abrasions, the slightly dented corner at the bottom he'd damaged years ago falling from a ridge. This was precisely the badge that had been confiscated from him after the Blood River disaster, the incident that had led to his expulsion from the Corps. The chill running down Ransom's spine was no longer the cold air of the vault. It was the horrifying realization of being watched, being chosen. This badge should have been in official archives, or permanently lost to the dust. Somehow, this creature had not only found it but brought it deep into the mine, placing it where it would be found. "It knows who I am," Ransom whispered, his voice hoarse with dust and tension. "It knows what I lost." The massacre was no longer an investigative mission. It was a prearranged confrontation. The predator wasn't merely a hungry beast. It was an intelligent entity, perhaps vengeful or challenging him. The badge was not just a clue. It was an invitation, a mockery of his guilt and failure. Ransom Kaine felt his experience and reason threatened. He had faced mutated hunters and ruthless mercenaries, but never a threat capable of studying, understanding, and personalizing its attack to this extent. He stared down at the badge, then into the endless darkness of the tunnel ahead. This creature was fast, strong, and seemingly required no common food, only fluid and terror. He tucked the badge into his breast pocket, a symbolic act of accepting this new burden. The creature needed a name that was both a warning and a target. Night-Husk, he decided. The name instantly took root in his mind. The gaunt physique, the absolute nocturnal activity, and the way it left its victims as empty shells. Ransom Kaine left the cinder vaults carrying a terrible truth and a recovered, lost badge. He knew the silence was over. By leaving the badge, the Night-Husk had ended his isolation. The confrontation was inevitable, and it would not follow normal rules. The Night-Husk had brought the fight to Ransom, and now, Ransom had to prepare for a war he never thought he'd fight. A war between his guilty past and a superhuman threat that knew everything about him. Red Mountain was no longer his prison. It had become his hunting ground. Immediately upon Ransom's return to the outpost, the feeling of being hunted escalated to something nearly tangible. The Night-Husk did not act like a cornered animal. It acted like a patient avenger. Instead of rushing to attack, the creature initiated a psychological siege, a tactic designed to melt the hardened nerves of a retired ranger. During the first night after Ransom left the vaults, the sounds around the outpost were nightmarish. The Night-Husk moved on four limbs with frightening speed, circling just beyond the range of Ransom's makeshift floodlights. The sound of metal scraping repeated irregularly, but always close enough to keep Ransom's tension taut. The most terrifying aspect was the eyes. They didn't merely reflect light. They emitted a ghostly green glow in the darkness, staring unblinking from the edge of the shadows. Ransom tried to remain calm, checking every window and bolt, but he knew the outpost was an old structure, not a fortress. If the Night-Husk truly wanted in, it wouldn't need the front door. The climax of the menace occurred at dawn. As the faint light began to filter through the valley, Ransom found the Night-Husk's gift right on his doorstep. It was a hand belonging to one of the missing victims, not chewed off, but cleanly severed at the wrist. The hand was placed on the damp ground, palm up, like an unambiguous warning. "I know where you are. I can reach you at any moment." Disgust mixed with cold rage flared within Ransom. The fear was gone. All that remained was the focus of a forgotten fighting machine. The Night-Husk had made the Predator's biggest mistake. It had turned Ransom into a target, and that target was now fighting back. He knew he couldn't hide. Running away was merely delaying death. He had to turn the outpost, his former sanctuary, into his final weapon. Ransom began the process of war preparation. He scoured the storage locker that had been sealed for years. He found 3 remaining military M84 stun grenades, invaluable for disorienting a creature reliant on sight and speed. He checked his Winchester 12-gauge shotgun. Standard buckshot wouldn't suffice. He loaded specialized slugs with titanium-reinforced, silver-coated warheads, ammunition he had saved from his time hunting mutated creatures in the red zone. Finally, he found a small box containing mining-grade C4 plastic explosive. Not enough to blow up a mountain, but enough to create a shockwave and cause damage if correctly positioned. Ransom began fortifying the outpost. 1. He sealed the windows with thick wooden planks, leaving only narrow slits for his rifle. 2. He set up tripwires and alarm bells around the outpost perimeter to identify the direction of attack. 3. He established a remote detonation system for the small block of C4, intending to use it not as a primary weapon, but as a shocking feint. As the sun set, painting Red Mountain in blood-red hues, Ransom Kaine donned his old leather armor. He was a disgraced former ranger, now standing between isolation and a monster that knew his past. He no longer sought redemption from the system, but from himself by killing this non-human threat. But he knew the Night-Husk would expect a siege. Ransom decided he would not defend. He would bring the fight directly to its lair. He would return to the mine, where it felt strongest, and end everything in the dark. Ransom Kaine returned to the cinder vaults in thick darkness, just hours after the Night-Husk had placed the warning hand on his threshold. He carried no hope or fear, only the cold focus of a man who had accepted death as a possibility. He knew the Night-Husk was waiting for him. The creature was intelligent, and it would anticipate Ransom defending at the outpost. His return to its den was the first move to throw it off balance. Ransom moved deep into the tunnel, his flashlight off. He relied on his ears, his scent, and the experiences ingrained in his subconscious. The Night-Husk reacted to the intrusion immediately. The sound of claws scraping on rock echoed through the tunnel. Fast, unpredictable. "I'm here, you bastard," Ransom muttered. He immediately sprinted toward the collapsed excavation area where he had found the badge. He hid the small C4 block in a corner, connected the detonator wire, and retreated to a tactical position sheltered by a large rock. The Night-Husk, provoked by Ransom's audacity, decided on a frontal attack. It burst from the shadows, its gaunt form nearly invisible, only the blazing green eyes serving as the sole reference point. It moved at incredible speed, a specter of pure velocity. Just as the Night-Husk prepared to deliver a fatal pounce, Ransom pulled the pin on a grenade. M84. The stun grenade exploded with a deafening noise and intense light, right in the creature's path. The Night-Husk was not merely stunned. It was utterly disoriented. Its terrifying speed now became a liability. It whined, a sound like scraping metal, and stumbled back, crashing against the rock wall. This was the opportunity. Ransom activated the C4 wire. The explosion was small but sharp and concussive, amplified by the enclosed space of the mine, collapsing a nearby section of the wall and violently pushing the Night-Husk back. Though not dead, it was severely injured. A shriek of agony echoed through the tunnel. As the enraged creature, temporarily blinded and wounded in one leg, struggled to find Ransom amidst the smoke and dust, Ransom was already directly above it. He lunged, giving the Night-Husk no chance to recover. This was hand-to-hand combat between a man trained to kill and a superior biological entity. The Night-Husk swung its razor-sharp talons, but Ransom evaded based on years of close-quarters combat experience. He used his body weight to suppress the staggering creature, pinning one arm and gripping its neck with the other. Ransom felt the rough, dried-out skin of the creature. It tried to bite, but Ransom used his knee to lock its jaws shut. The moment stretched into eternity. Ransom drew the shotgun, already loaded with the silver titanium slug. He positioned the barrel precisely where he predicted its heart or critical biological component would be, beneath the Night-Husk's gaunt ribcage. The shotgun roared. The specialized slug tore through, ending the creature's life in a single blast. The Night-Husk convulsed violently, then slumped, its dry, metallic breath extinguished, the green eyes fading into lifeless black. Ransom Kaine stood there, his body shaking from tension, sweat, and grime. He had won. The next morning, Ransom spent hours cleaning the scene. He collected all evidence of the Night-Husk's non-human nature and the mining blast. He buried the remains of the 3 gold panners as decently as possible. Upon returning to the nearest settlement, Ransom sought out Captain Reyes, who managed this sparse frontier area. Reyes was a seasoned man, familiar with the troubles of the Red Zone, and the one who had signed Ransom's expulsion order. Ransom reported, "Captain, I found Silas Vance's team. They mined too deep into a poisonous gas vein, likely methane. There was a small explosion and a cave-in. I found evidence they were secretly collaborating with a larger smuggling ring. More weapons, explosives, and signs of illegal transactions. All buried in the collapse." Reyes stared at Ransom. He knew Ransom was lying. A typical collapse wouldn't leave behind deep claw marks or desiccated corpses. But Reyes also saw something else. Renewed focus, a rekindled fire in Ransom's eyes. Moreover, disappearing smugglers was a convenient narrative for the authorities and helped Reyes avoid trouble with threats beyond his control. Reyes nodded slowly. "Kaine, you did well. Forget the smugglers. That's outside your jurisdiction." He paused, then continued with a meaningful look. "Kaine, I need someone who can handle situations that are beyond the normal scope of investigation. Part-time job. Are you interested?" Ransom Kaine knew he was accepting a new life, bound by a cruel lie he had to maintain. He would never be able to share what he had truly fought. But he had redeemed his purpose. "I'm interested, Captain," Ransom replied. He had lost the badge of honesty, but he had found the badge of meaningful existence. He returned to Red Mountain, no longer an exiled ghost, but the guardian of a secret, waiting for the next threat to emerge from the shadows. Ransom Kaine existed at Red Mountain like a ghost in broken machinery. His dilapidated outpost was a wound on the scarred landscape, where the cold winds carried the smell of dust and regret. He was no hermit. He was a disgraced former ranger, exiled from the system after a fatal error he could not purge from his memory. His tinkering with broken radio equipment was not a job, but a futile attempt to reconnect with the world that had cast him out. Solitude was his penance, and he wore it grudgingly, yearning for an opportunity to redeem the badge he had lost. Red Mountain was not merely a refuge but his own harsh prison. He maintained an arsenal and a set of forgotten combat skills, waiting for a threat great enough to justify his continued existence. The false peace Ransom maintained was shattered by Silas Vance, a man whose greed was matched only by his paranoia. Silas hadn't come because of stolen gold, but because of an inexplicable loss. 3 robust men from his crew had vanished in a single night. Silas's story was riddled with contradictions, yet the details of the scene snagged Kaine's attention. Dried blood spatter inconsistent with the reported injuries, and deep claw marks unlike anything left by a bear or any common predator. A feeling that something was wrong overpowered Ransom's weariness. He agreed to investigate, not for Silas, but because an old ranger's instinct told him this threat stretched beyond the scope of ordinary patrol. Following the tracks up the chilling ravines, Ransom pushed deep into the abandoned mining claims, where the air was thick with deadly silence. Ransom located the old mine shaft. Inside, the dense stench of brine and death mingled with the profound darkness that concealed a terrible truth. He found bodies systematically ravaged, not merely torn apart, but drained of fluids, leaving them like brittle, dry leather sacks. This was the work of a sophisticated, vicious predator, one that did not belong in the natural ecosystem. Amid the scattered bone fragments and rust, Ransom Kaine found a small, cold object. His own old badge. That the creature had carried the badge from some unknown location and placed it among the carnage was a horrifying affirmation. This monstrosity was not just a beast, it possessed intelligence, had been watching him, and held some secret link to his buried past. Ransom named it the Night-Husk, a gaunt shape, eyes glowing in the dark, and possessing terrible speed. The moment Ransom retreated from the mine entrance, the sensation of being hunted ceased being a hunch and became certainty. The Night-Husk had changed tactics. It was no longer content to hide in the cold caves. It had chosen to bring the fight to Kaine's doorstep, turning his isolated outpost into a besieged arena where Kaine's solitude was now a critical liability. The first night after the horrific discovery, Ransom did not sleep. He sat in the shadows, lighting only a small oil lamp to prevent the darkness from swallowing his vision entirely. The atmosphere was so strained he could feel its physical pressure. The Night-Husk did not attack. It enacted a slow, merciless psychological siege. Ransom heard soft, sharp scratching on the granite outside. The sound was not the scrape of a hungry animal. It was deliberate, calculated to break his nerves. Sometimes, the noise paused just outside the thin wooden wall, close enough for Ransom to imagine its ragged breath, but never close enough for him to pinpoint a target. The Night-Husk's glowing eyes were its most potent weapon. Like 2 smokeless, red coals, they slid past cracks and boarded up windows. They did not linger. They flashed by, quick as lightning, confirming Kaine was under surveillance. Every appearance was a cold reminder of the predator's cunning intelligence. Around midnight, the Night-Husk began to move. It ran circles around the outpost, not a chaotic attack, but a high-speed patrol. The sound of 4 wiry limbs pounding the dirt and stone created a dry, rasping hiss, like a ring of razor blades circling the cabin. Its speed was unnerving. Kaine knew that if he opened the door or tried to escape, he would be torn to shreds within seconds. He tried to broadcast an emergency signal on the radio, but he knew how remote the area was. What he managed to transmit were only useless bursts of static. He was utterly alone, facing an inexplicable threat. Isolation, which he had accepted as punishment, was now a death sentence. When the weak light of dawn began to push back the dark, the Night-Husk temporarily retreated, but it left a gift. Ransom cautiously opened the heavy iron door, his shotgun loaded with specialized ammunition. He stopped instantly. Right on the threshold, placed atop a flat rock, lay a horrifying object, the dried, desiccated hand of one of the missing miners. It was not mangled or chewed. It was chillingly cleaned and placed with deliberate care, the skeletal fingers pointing inward. But it was not the gore that ignited Ransom's fury. Tied tightly around the withered wrist was a piece of old leather cord. That cord secured a small, tarnished metal clasp, the locker hook from his old ranger uniform, which he had discarded years ago. The Night-Husk was more than a predator. It was a stalker, a psychological torturer. It didn't just know he was here. It mocked his past, his failures, and his regrets. In that moment, the fear finally dissolved, replaced by a cold, pure rage. "You made a mistake," Ransom muttered, his voice hoarse. "You made this personal." Ransom was no longer motivated by survival. He was driven by the need for annihilation. He spent the entire day converting the outpost from a hideout into a grim fortress and a deadly trap. First, he reinforced the weak points. All remaining windows were sealed with thick plywood and heavy metal bolts. He didn't aim for a permanent shelter, but one solid enough to survive the first assault and allow for a counterattack. He built a narrow kill zone just inside the main door, where if the Night-Husk breached the barrier, it would be met with concentrated, close-range firepower. Then, he raided his forgotten arsenal. His double-barreled shotgun was reloaded with specialized slug rounds, large lead and tungsten core projectiles designed to penetrate thick armor or heavy bone, instead of standard buckshot. This was the ammunition he saved for the largest predators. He found 3 concussion smoke grenades, remnants from his ranger days, stored in a watertight ammo box. They wouldn't inflict significant physical damage, but they would create a thick smokescreen and a powerful sonic blast, enough to disorient any creature relying on speed and sight. His most crucial weapon was explosives. Ransom Kaine had worked the mines before joining the Rangers. He still maintained a small, high-grade industrial explosive reserve. He rigged 3 small blocks of plastic explosives, attaching them to electric detonators and long spools of wire. He did not intend to blow up his outpost. He planned to use the explosives as a tactical tool. He carefully taped the handle of his combat hunting knife, making it an extension of his arm. He donned the old, light ballistic vest he kept, something that wouldn't stop a direct swipe, but might deflect a weaker thrust. As the sun set again, bringing the bitter cold of Red Mountain, Ransom finalized his preparations. He was no longer the reclusive Ransom Kaine. He had reverted to Ranger Kaine, a operative trained to fight the impossible. He realized that defense was only prolonging the inevitable. The Night-Husk was intelligent and patient. It would wait until he was exhausted, out of ammunition, or made a mistake. If he wanted to win, he had to draw it into an environment it did not expect, where its speed and night vision would be neutralized, deep inside the mine shaft. His goal was not to kill the Night-Husk in his home. His goal was to lure it, injure it, and then finish it in its own lair. Ransom carefully stowed 2 blocks of explosives and the smoke grenades into a tactical pack. He carried the shotgun, the knife, and a cold, clinical thirst for vengeance. He looked around the outpost one last time, his refuge, his prison, and now the launch pad for his final war. He checked the battery gauge on his helmet-mounted headlamp. He knew his survival depended on controlling the light and the dark. "All right, Night-Husk," he whispered into the encroaching shadows. "The games are over. Now we find out who the hunter is." He unbolted the door, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and stepped out, heading toward the ridge where the black maw of the mine awaited. Ransom returned to the mine not to defend, but to assault. He used the military smoke grenades to disorient the Night-Husk in the confined environment, forcing it into a narrow corner. Then, he detonated a small block of explosives, creating a diversionary attack that severely wounded the creature. As the Night-Husk, stunned and enraged, lunged out of the darkness, Ransom met it in brutal close-quarters combat. He used his hand-to-hand combat expertise to evade the lethal swipes and, finally, with a precise shot from his specialized shotgun, he brought the creature down in the narrow passage. The next morning, Ransom meticulously cleaned the scene, ensuring every trace of the Night-Husk's non-human nature was erased. In the nearest town, he reported to Captain Reyes, fabricating a detailed story about a large smuggling ring that had disappeared together in a mine explosion. Reyes, though not entirely convinced, recognized the determined glint in Ransom's eye and the change in his demeanor. Reyes offered him a standing, part-time position, a silent acknowledgement that Ransom Kaine was the only man capable of dealing with threats beyond the scope of ordinary investigation. Ransom had reclaimed his purpose, but the price was living with a necessary dark secret. Ransom Kaine knew that waiting in the outpost was a form of surrender. The Night-Husk had turned his isolation into a psychological siege. If Ransom wanted to win, he had to strip away its advantages: the darkness, the vastness of the desert, and fear itself. Around 2 a.m., when the moon was shrouded by heavy clouds and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Ransom left his shelter, armed with a sturdy, short-barreled shotgun, a short-handled hatchet, and 3 military smoke grenades salvaged from his old ranger days. He was not a defensive warrior. He was prey turning himself into bait. The old mining complex was a lethal maze, a perfect environment for the Night-Husk. But it was also a confined space that Ransom could manipulate with tactics. He moved with the silence and precision of a man who had lived alongside death. The smell of sulfur, copper, and faint decay led him on. He didn't need a flashlight. He had learned to see with his ears and senses, anticipating shadows that moved faster than light. His plan was divided into 3 stages: isolation, stun, and termination. He proceeded deep into the main tunnel where the desiccated corpses had been found, stopping at a narrow junction. Ransom placed a small charge of residual mining explosive, just enough for a loud bang, not for destruction, onto an old support beam. He armed the detonator wire. He knew the Night-Husk would not ignore this sound, considering itself the lord of the silence. While waiting, he heard a light, rapid scraping sound on the rock floor in the distance. The Night-Husk was approaching, drawn by the blatant intrusion. When the creature was only a few dozen meters away, Ransom hurled the first smoke grenade. It bounced and detonated. Thick, gray-white military smoke instantly enveloped the passageway, neutralizing the creature's glowing eyes. The Night-Husk was not completely blind, but its advantage of speed and vision through the deep shadows was severely curtailed. An enraged hiss echoed in the tunnel. The creature felt tricked, confined. It charged into the smoke, its speed unchecked, relying on scent to locate Ransom. Boom! The explosive charge activated. The shockwave and a spray of small rock fragments struck the Night-Husk, not killing it, but concussing it and snapping the bone in its right foreleg. Its shriek became distorted and desperate. That was Ransom's signal. He charged into the smoke, the shotgun muzzle already raised. He saw the Night-Husk's gaunt frame stumbling, trying to adjust to the pain and disorientation. The Night-Husk reacted with hunting instinct, swinging its deadly claws. It was faster than any foe Ransom had ever faced, but the injury slowed it by 1/10 of a second, enough. Ransom ducked, using the shotgun as a shield as he slammed the hatchet handle hard against the creature's head. The Night-Husk staggered and recoiled. For a fleeting moment, Ransom saw its face in the dim light reflected from the shoulder-mounted lamp, hollow black eyes, long jaws lined with needle teeth, and pale, drum-tight skin. It was not an animal. It was a hungry, hideous entity. The Night-Husk, realizing it was cornered, roared and leaped for a final desperate attack. Ransom held his ground. He knew if the strike landed, he would be the next dry husk of skin. He gripped the weapon tight, aiming for the creature's delicate chest cavity. Crack! The specialized slug, loaded with a solid brass casing and a steel core, tore through the air and slammed straight into the Night-Husk's sternum. The force of the impact did more than penetrate. It shattered the skeletal structure and ruptured the creature's core. The Night-Husk dropped, making a wet, heavy thud on the rocky floor. The tremors quickly subsided, and the creature lay still, an odd, shriveled corpse. Ransom stood there, gasping, listening to the dripping of blood onto the cold stone. Victory brought no elation, only emptiness and profound exhaustion. The sun began to crest, painting the peaks of Red Mountain in shades of orange and rose. Ransom Kaine, once again, became an unbadged ranger. But this time his job was not patrolling, but cleaning up. He spent the next 6 hours covering the scene. First was the disposal of the Night-Husk. Could not be seen. No one could know of its existence. He dragged the strange body deep into a partially collapsed tunnel, using the remaining explosives to completely collapse the entrance, burying the creature beneath tons of rock and soil. Next, he meticulously erased the signs of battle, from the Night-Husk's dried blood to stray bullet marks. He found the corpses of Silas Vance's 3 men and brought them to the mine entrance. He staged a new scene, a catastrophic mining explosion caused by carelessness. He placed metal excavation tools near the bodies, scattering some sulfur powder and coal dust, creating the impression of a tragic industrial failure. His old badge? He planted it in the pocket of the 4th miner, whom he designated as the leader of the supposed gang. When everything was set, Ransom drove his rugged old vehicle south to the nearest federal security headquarters. He looked battered, his face smeared with dirt and minor wounds, but his gaze was steady. He requested an audience with Captain Reyes, the area commander, a stern, aging man whose tired eyes had seen far too much bad reality. "Kaine," Reyes said, his voice cold, "I heard you found Vance's 3 miners. You look like you've been in a war." Ransom sat down, offering no apology or excuse. He held the gaze steady. "Not 3 miners, Captain. And they weren't miners. They were major smugglers using the mining operation as a front." He began his meticulously crafted story. They got into a fight over a shipment of illegal gold and explosives. The detonation happened right at the mine entrance. Too powerful. Completely collapsed the main tunnel. All 4 are dead. Their bodies were badly mangled. The explosion was too great. There was nothing to salvage. Reyes leaned back in his chair, studying Ransom. Reyes had investigated countless disappearances. Ransom's story was too perfect, too neat. Furthermore, Ransom Kaine, exiled for moral rectitude, was now baldly lying about a major smuggling ring to cover up an unexplainable death. "And how do you know they were smugglers, Kaine?" Reyes asked, his voice steeped in doubt. "They had things that didn't belong in a mine," Ransom replied, producing a small piece of an old military ammunition crate. "And there was a stolen ranger badge in their leader's pocket. They probably killed someone to get it." Reyes looked at the piece of evidence, then back at Ransom. He didn't believe the smuggling gang story, but he believed the underlying truth. Whatever had happened, it was cleaned up. Order and safety had been restored, which was all the authority truly cared about. Most importantly, Reyes saw the change. Ransom Kaine was no longer the tired shadow living in regret. He had regained the focus and necessary ruthlessness. He had solved a problem the system could not touch on his own. Reyes sighed. "All right, Kaine. I will record that 4 smugglers accidentally killed themselves in a mine blast." Reyes put the file down. "I cannot fully reinstate you, but this region is short on people capable of handling problems outside the usual scope of investigation. I will pay you an unofficial consultancy wage. Assignments will only be channeled through me." Ransom nodded. It was not the redemption he had once dreamed of. He would never regain the official badge. But he had found his purpose again, to be the secret gatekeeper for the line between the world of men and the things lurking beneath. "Consider our ledgers balanced, Kaine. But if anything strange happens out there, you are the first person I call." Ransom Kaine stood up, The burden of exile was replaced by the weight of a far darker secret. He had fought a monster, and to win, he had to become the keeper of its existence. He accepted. "Understood, Captain." Ransom turned and walked away, his steps now heavy with new responsibility, yet lightened by decisive action. Red Mountain was no longer a prison. It was his eternal battlefield.